Thanks, Wade. I have a simple job here, just introducing people. We're switching the first two speakers around for technical reasons. And our first speaker is Dr. Lawrence Kazmierski, whose title is changing, and he will also clue you in as to his exact position at NREL. Right.
Yeah, we never know, actually. So, hey, I want to thank you very much, and especially I'll start off by thanking Calvin on the AV stuff who worked with me an hour and a half yesterday during lunchtime. He missed his lunch, so maybe the people can give him a little bit more money on this whole thing. And I also want to thank the organizers here at Rice for this opportunity to come here. And I also have something for Dr. Smalley, because I think I've heard so much here about all the things for solar. You see, I learned a long time ago that there's no money in this solar stuff. So I do solar ties. I design solar ties. So and it's perfect for this shirt too. So
I didn't wear a tie.
I think this is. And also, I have a scarf, okay, as well. So great. And I have one for you too, in case I go a little long on this talk. Just cover everything. Okay, and I agreed with everything that Ken Zweibel said yesterday, first of all, and then I'll get out of that. So, well, when I came, I didn't know exactly what I was going to talk about, and so I designed a talk around what I thought was the subject matter here, and I thought that this would be very interesting to most people. And then I heard that there were going to be scientists here, not just the economists, because I thought this would be just perfect for those economists. So I have changed things a little bit. If anybody understands that and it makes sense, I think maybe I'm in the wrong room. Is that right? It's funded. So this is really what I'm going to talk about, and I'll also say that I am the director of the National Center for Photovoltaics at NREL. And the technology manager position was kind of a holding tank for a while until we could find someone who had skills, not me. So we have someone coming on board. So I'm going to talk. I changed things actually quite a bit yesterday, sitting in back after I heard some things, because it's going to be an opportunity, first of all, I think, to tell about something that's going to happen this next week with the U.S. PV industry. Their roadmap is going to be rolled out in San Francisco on Wednesday, but I just happen to have the data and the slides, so I think I'm going to show this ahead of time here, and hope they don't hear about it until Wednesday. So I put this in it, and I took some other things out, and so I may go a little bit over this half an hour or 40 minutes or so, but I hope you'll bear with me. So. And also, Dr. Smalley yesterday told me that this was a sophisticated audience. And he says, how can you work so damn long with a slide like this as an opening slide? He says, maybe this whole audience here should have something a little bit better. He told me that he heard there was even a Nobel Prize winner in the audience someplace. So he's told me to go back last night, and instead of looking at the replay of the Astros game, to go ahead and do something a little bit more toward this. So I did a little bit of an opening here for this. beginning anyway. And also the fact that Sister Eustochia told me that when I was in grade school that the only time that you can miss Mass on Sunday would be to come to give a talk at Rice University. So I think it's okay. So anyway, you know, we heard this pretty much this last day, all right, about where we are, where it has to go, okay, and we're going to hear a lot about how we're going to get here. This has been a very, very useful first day yesterday for me because I learned a lot and also have seen an advocacy group that I think that photovoltaics needs very, very badly to be united into this for our U.S. efforts at funding this. So I hope at least that will come out of this. You know, I notice the older I get, there are more anniversaries just about every year. But the big one, of course, up here is the 50th anniversary of the Bell telephone solar cell. Back in 1953, it actually started to be worked at Bell Labs by this group. This is Gerald Pearson, Darrell Chapin, and Calvin Fuller, the three people who are accredited with the invention of the solar cell. We put together with the IEEE an exhibit that has been going around the world this last year that had not only a lot of historical facts about it and everything, but also some artifacts, the first cell, the first module, and all these things that went into it, and also a lot of historical video. Normally I would show some of this, but with everything set up, I won't show any. If anybody's interested, I have it to show, or if anyone wants copies, we did kind of a glorified DVD on the history of this whole thing. That's interesting. But anyway, it started here, and what's kind of neat about this, if you look at this is off the kiosk that goes, is they started really in 1953 in January and February. And if you go through this whole timeline, looking at their log books and everything from the labs and everything, in April of '54, they announced this cell. They went from below 1% to cells that were above 6%. By the end of that year, they had a product. So from birth, okay, for them until it made it out into the field, they had modules placed in Georgia to power telephone repeaters. 2 years. And this is one of the problems we have now with our technology. It just does not go from the laboratory into the manufacturing phase so fast, let alone having a viable product. And it's one of the things I think we have to do in solar and in photovoltaics especially, is cut down this time from lab discovery until it makes it out by use by the industry. So these guys were very good too because, you know, marketing at Bell Labs was incredible. They got news releases out right away. They held a big thing in New York. It hit all the papers, New York Times, even some of the local papers there, pictures all over. They said there was more publicity about the solar cell than there was about the transistor when it came out. So it's quite incredible on what Bell did for this. And this is solar cell number 1, a picture of it. That, by the way, is a shell cell in the background. I'll tell you that. It's a 10-inch shell wafer in the background, about 15%. And in '54, we had this one cell, 2 centimeters squared, about 5 milliwatts in power. And in 2003, last year, we shipped something like 600 billion cells with 7.5, whatever this is, and 700, almost 3/4 of a gigawatt. These are all things that you can use, Nate, when you're giving talks, because you always have those big numbers, tera this and all that stuff. And actually, I brought the cell with. People get a little bit skittish when they realize that I carry this in my pocket like this. But this is Bell cell number 1. And the incredible part is, 50 years later, it still works. All right? We measured this under standard conditions. Bell measured it they really measured this at 5.3%. We measured it at 1.5%. So 50 years, and I tell people that I'm just a little bit older than this solar cell, and hell, I have parts of me that don't work anymore either. So I'll let you pass this around. These are, by the way, these other things in the back are some Hoffman solar cells from the same era that were used were made up after Vanguard, because they're a little bit bigger, but they were going to be on the next mission that never took place in that series. So if you want to go ahead and pass that around, and please don't steal it, because I'll be in a lot of trouble. So we've come a lot in this technology and bring it to the marketplace. You know, the Bell Labs people even did things at the same time on making toys to show this stuff really worked. They made a Rector set type model of a thing. And I think one thing that our industry is doing is they're starting to be pretty good about this in marketing renewables. And I'm going to show you 2 examples of commercials. This is very funny for me to be talking about this. The first one is from wind. I don't know whether this is 10 terawatts or 20 terawatts of wind. And so we're also happy that GE just bought a solar cell company, and I understand they already have a commercial ready for photovoltaics of the same. We've seen they have a bunch of these out there. But very good, a lot of humor in this, and kind of pointing out what we need for all of our technologies is kind of this tipping point. The thing to take it from where we were, that'll bring it over the edge to where it becomes reality. It's pretty nice that photovoltaics, okay, is making into these things that we're seeing in the United States on television. This is just going to be shown now, I think, nationwide by Shell. And there's one thing that I saw this commercial so many times looking at that I never noticed until about 2 weeks ago when I was getting for the Ternary conference in Denver. And that is, did you see the Ken? Is exactly this. There's Terry standing in a sea of copper indium selenide, solar cells, thin films, okay, a technology that is coming along and starting to make it into the marketplace. And they chose for their commercial to focus for people who might see it on the thin film part of the technology. We're talking a lot about nanotechnology, of course, here, but we're going to be able to know that thin films, okay, are kind of a current and coming up technology, but are also coming into a 3rd generation technology, as I'll show you for some approaches. Well, let me talk about PV in the USA and worldwide, what's being done. And I think I will start off here looking at how the industry looked at this. So, you know, here we are in maybe the year 2000. The industry looked, they put together a roadmap. You know, they saw how the markets were increasing, and they focused on coming up with a roadmap that had investments in policy and in R&D for the United States in order to get greater market shares and in order to be able to prepare ourselves for the next generation of technology. So they looked at this, and everything is going along fine. And, of course, what came in the year 2000 was their roadmap, this very thing here that addressed so many of the things that had to be done in the United States from getting this technology out there. And they were all happy and everything, and it went along. And even the National Energy Plan, okay, if you look in there, has photovoltaics, you know, to be very, very fair. It does have a lot about it being a distributed resource, recognize this in there, so that President Bush's National Energy Plan does have photovoltaics as part of it. So to be fair, okay, it was also focused on the industry and pointed out that it is part of what the United States is at least saying in what was put together. Of course, a lot of people look at it this way, and they think that the energy plan was mainly looking at ANWR and everything else. And I always thought the problem with photovoltaics was it was spelled wrong. And I thought that perhaps, especially in Texas, if we were photovoltaics or something like that and got the oil in it, and you know, if you look back at the first module that was put out by Bell Labs, it was encapsulated in oil, all the things in order to encapsulate the cells and match the thing. And so I think Bell Labs had it in their minds that what photovoltaics was going to be a oil sequestration plant at that time and put it all in the thing so it wouldn't get out. So anyway, so they were looking. Then came along 2003, and boy, everything went up in the world. Boy, that is great, you know, 35% growth rate on the whole thing. But then when we look here at the United States, bingo, it fell by 17% or something like that in its market share, in its shipments. And this this bothered the industry, obviously, quite a bit. And so they went back to the drawing board. That even though everything went on, there's greater than 30% growth rate in the world for the last 6 years. Even over that period, the average growth rate for the U.S.-based industry is about 15 or 16%. So it still is, but they're worried about what this trend is looking like. So they went back to this and came up with the new roadmap. Oops, and what are the reasons? Well, we heard them already. Japan, okay, with their system of subsidies, okay. Actually, they're incentives, not subsidies. That's what we really should be calling them. Japan incentive program, okay, and they came up with all these things. It's a capital investment buy down, and you can see a correlation, and it goes down over time. You can see a correlation to the number of systems put out there and also the pricing of the system coming down at the same time. And of course, in Germany, they did something a little different. They did the feed-in tariff and to bring this down. And you can look at this, and of course the people from Europe will recognize, I'm just going to put this up here better than I can, is that you can see that when the feed-in law went in, the sales went way up because they pay more per kilowatt hour than the people, they get more per kilowatt hour than they pay. You can see that one place it leveled off because there was a backing off, lot like what happened to the wind program here in the United States. Then it took off again in 2003. They get something like 61 to 63 cents a kilowatt hour for every kilowatt hour of electricity they feed into the grid. About 3 times or 4 times what they pay for the electricity. And next week on Monday, there's a meeting between the U.S. industry, the European industry, and the Japanese industry to come up with some conclusions on what sort of system might make it big for the United States as far as pushing on the policy side. Obviously, the other countries also want to have their businesses, Sharp USA, for instance, to open up this thing, because they think that the next big surge in photovoltaics has to be in the United States, more than California, but in the United States as a whole. So it fostered growth and everything. So now what they looked at here is they thought, well, instead of maybe the U.S. looking for weapons of mass destruction, that the industry could turn them maybe to look for methods of mass production for the technology, something that's needing to bring these capacities up. So as I said, they turned to this new roadmap, which is shown here. And I just kind of summarized some of the things. This is the only copy, I think, that's outside that whole thing that I have here. And I summarized some of the, oops, I thought I did. Some of the goals there in 2025, half of the new U.S. electricity generation, half of what is added that year would be photovoltaics. By 2030, you can read all these things. They recognize very big, too, that a big investment has to be in jobs. Congress wants to hear what this does for employment, and they've done an analysis in here on what the effects would be of implementing this roadmap on that industry. And by 2030, the direct employment is something like 260,000 people, direct employment. This doesn't count the people who make glass and all those things, but the direct employment in the industry. And finally, there is a 2050 thing where electricity is equivalent to 40 to 50% of that consumed in the U.S. building sector. So that it's pretty, for the industry, this is a very, very aggressive goal. Very aggressive. And there are a number of things in this whole thing that you can see. And the approach is how they're going to do this. One is on the policy side. We heard from Shirley so many things yesterday. Shirley was part of this process, by the way, especially on the policy of putting these things in there. That it means many of these things you see up here, all the way from looking at tax credits to other things that to boost all this stuff, anyway. So, and then finally, something also very important that they recognize is to maintain technology leadership. And they recognize that these budgets right now for R&D are slow, very, very small, and they're calling for a budget of $250 million a year, somehow ramped up between now and 2010, and expected to stay in for a 10 to 15-year time frame at that level to bring this about. So, and they support everything from looking at current technologies to help those things perform better, all the way through looking at the next generations that we need. So the roadmap does cover all these things. The industry recognizes that they need these for their next generation of technology ownership and market share. So it's based on the fact here, you know, they did analysis of where the costs are going into their systems, and showing that at least the R&D factor is very big at first, because the major part of the cost is still the module, and to bring that down significantly. This is kind of a summary of everything, this table. I'm not going to go on this, but I think that they spent just about a year of analysis on this with various groups from DOE checking this over, NREL, some groups from Europe had gone over things as well. So I'll leave one copy of this with you here, and leave the only copy with you here, so you can have this if you have to check anything on this. And also, they made a big thing about well, and this is some analysis that was done by Robert Margolis from NREL. And this is kind of the baseline case, what would happen if we just continued on as we are. And this is what they project to be if for solar, if we make the investments. Not the same, because Margolis's investments are far more aggressive, you know, with carbon tax credits and everything else in there than the industry. But they show that there's certainly within that envelope of what Margolis says can happen. And even beyond that, if you want, well, and it shows also that they can have a 10-year acceleration, okay, in what the market penetration could be, and that's pretty big. And also they point out too, and then use the analysis provided in other parts of the world. This will pop up there in a second, but from Europe, okay, from EREC, they're even more aggressive. They say by 2040, 40% of the world's electricity, 31% of the world's electricity will come from PV. So at least there's something to back. And of course, they like to point out that what is pushing this, okay, it's kind of it's the economy, stupid type of thing, and that it is jobs. And their analysis shows that there is a direct correlation to what the roadmap can add to what where the baseline is going. And finally, okay, where the U.S. industry shipments would be, as if we keep the business as it's going now, and to where it would be if we this roadmap were implemented. So, at least some people have some plans, and if you're interested in billions of kilowatt hours per year, okay, that's a pretty striking analysis they did on this as well. So even, okay, investing in what we have now and projecting what we have now can have some significant effects on how we enter the U.S. markets. Maybe it's not the way to provide all 28 terawatts or whatever it is in 2050, but it certainly will make a dent in it and provide a basis for this. And they recognize as well that new technologies. And of course, they're not dumb. And here, as they put in here, good timing that release it this week, is that solar is available to a sufficient level in every congressional district in the United States. It's kind of the power for the people, whether the people are liberals or conservatives on this go. So let's look a little bit very quickly at these photovoltaic technologies. You know, we've seen some, Ken showed some things like this. This happens to be the thin film technologies, you know, the efficiencies going up as a function of time. And it is rather remarkable that if we look at this and compare it to some other things, that the thin film copper indium selenide has reached the same, in the laboratory, the same efficiency levels as polycrystalline silicon. This happens to be that device at 19.5% efficient, made within the last year. In fact, in the same run, okay, sometimes they call these one-of-a-kind devices. In the same run, these people ran a dozen cells that came out on their substrate. All 12 of them were over 19%, and 2 of them were at 19.5%. So that's, even in the research lab, they're starting to have some reproducibility for these things. Of course, there is a gap between the research lab and manufacturing, and that's one of the gaps that has to be addressed. This is some concentrator cells, you know, reaching up toward 40% efficiency on the end. That happens to be a Boeing Spectralab device. This is the technology, of course, that's used now almost completely in space for near-Earth orbit, triple junction cells. That's the one case we have of, as I said yesterday, of a technology that has replaced silicon, okay, as the technology of choice for photovoltaics. There's also, this happens to be the silicon status as we put over it, and also there is at least one case of a thin film under concentrating conditions at low concentration, copernadium selenide above 20%. That does have some significance because people are starting to look now again at low concentration for terrestrial application as well as very high concentration. I think that there are programs at a couple companies now that are looking at concentrations between 2 and 5%, and a device like this would fit into that very, very well because it has the potential of being less expensive, certainly, and then to have rather high performances. This is the Boeing Spectralab device. You can see it's rather complicated in its structure, okay, but once again, a small area device is only needed in order to produce a large amount of power because it's being designed for concentrators that are 500 to 1,000 times. So you need 1/500th to 1/1000th of the area. And as I said again, that was developed. So a lot of the things we're trying to do in the research lab is take things from where they are now, okay, to what can be attained. So things are going up, and to come up to levels that you know you can predict that they can put out. So that there's a lot of work on thin films now that certainly can do this and make these performance increases and performance contributions. Well, as I said, these programs, and in the U.S. especially, is looking at fostering now and near-term technologies. And we heard about these, and crystalline silicon and thin films are considered in that category. And I'll point out something, though. As soon, it was kind of alluded to yesterday, as soon as another technology starts making a threat, and I'll call it a threat, other technologies, silicon always seems to be able to respond. Okay, it's kind of a resilient technology so that all these other devices, okay, get developed. These are all silicon commercial cells that are in the 20% club, that people are aiming toward 20% modules, and they can now produce 20% cells fairly regularly in the commercial line using silicon. So every time Ken brings his companies up there and says, my gosh, we've reached 13.5% off the commercial line, okay, these guys boost it up because efficiency, performance is big right now for the markets. That every point you put on there is a huge thing. And of course, this is Dick Swanson from SunPower showing off a module up there. We've they have modules now up at about 17% out of that organization. So other things, realize there are a lot of other things. One big thing is this whole thing of cutting the time between discovery and manufacturing. And I think it's one of the problems the U.S. has right now. We heard yesterday so many times, it's not politics, it's the science. Well, I think it's politics because unless the support comes to the scientists to do this work, if the budgets don't at least keep up with what's going on in the world, with the competition, with what's happening with the budgets here, we're going to be in trouble. And they're not doing that. Science is being cut back. And if we don't support science, okay, on the federal level, I think we're going to hurt ourselves against the competition. And I'll give an example. I'm not a person to, by the way, to do anything about DOE, because I think generally the people at DOE, okay, at the level of Tex Wilkins, of Richard King and everything, are huge advocates and have helped, I mean, immensely in getting this stuff out there. There's no doubt about it. But sometimes things get tied up in other parts of the government. We proposed a building to address this thing of cutting the time between the market, between laboratory discovery, and handing it off to the industry. We proposed this program. It needed a building. It was proposed in 1997 when Admiral Truly came and took over our laboratory, and it was just funded last year. How can we wait 6, 7, 8, 10 years between a concept and getting something up there. The competition in Europe, they've proposed something, and if they have a building, 12, 15 months, they're occupying it. So I'm worried that the United States and what's set up with science now does not respond quickly enough to much of our community, but especially to the energy community for advanced energy concepts. And realize there are lots of other things. Balance of systems components are very big, R&D to make next generations of these, electronics, everything, and building integrated photovoltaics. PV is the best friend for that as well. So if you look at the other things, is that we continue with new generations of PV. And so I'm not sure that this is all what was meant back there with Dustin Hoffman, but I'm sure he must have had it in his mind that organic approaches to solar cells and all these third-generation technologies need investments and need very big investments now in our programs. I would say, I can tell you this, is we receive more money from CANARCA at NREL to do our third-generation technologies than the U.S. Department of Energy invests in it at our laboratory. So you can see this big shift is that funding is coming from different areas, but our part of our base at DOE should be exactly to look at these technologies as well. And if you look at the opportunities, I put thin films and not the things that Ken had talked about yesterday. Those are now technologies. Some other approaches, and I'll just show one example of this, and that is building on what's happened with these other cells. This is a copper indium selenide cell as it looks today, a thin film cell in that structure, is to go and start stacking this thin film cells, just like we did with the gallium arsenide cells on top of one another, aiming towards cells that are 20% with 25% with 20% modules eventually coming out of this. That this kind of intermediate thing, maybe this is generation 2.5 in there to come out with these technologies. And so there are other things that are being looked at, okay, besides the things that we promise, these huge efficiency things that can have a middle ground that still are very, very big because they're not easy. To the solar cell, this is AFM, look at the topography to that solar cell that's like the Rocky Mountains. And to have two cells stacked on top and work and everything, we have some demonstrations now, and we hope that this is the basis for aiming these thin films, okay, toward this 25, 28% technology. Nanotechnology, when we look at these things, all the time we mention materials, devices, and processing. I want to add one other thing not to forget in here when we look at this, and that's characterization. The materials, devices, and processing has a lot to do with the coming generations of technology. The characterization is a huge help to those people who are making silicon solar cells out there. I'm talking nanoscale characterization using STMs, AFMs, electron microscopes, all the other techniques that have come in are already being huge helps to improving those technologies. So when you look at this stuff for nanotechnologies, it's also the characterization people can be a big part of this, and eventually for doing inline characterization in manufacturing lines as well. So I don't know, what is this? Is there coming out second, third generations polymers? Okay, all the things we've heard so far. And this is kind of one look that we had of where we may be going with this and looking at module efficiencies, performance versus module cost, and looking at where we stand now with today's technologies, which are kind of in the green, where we're kind of headed. And if you look up there, you can see that in the purple or blue, where these can take us, these next generations of technologies, in two areas, really ultra low cost, and we consider things like organic solar cells, plastic solar cells in that area, large high performance, okay, very, very high performance still, but ultra low cost, and also a big part in there for ultra high efficiencies, for quantum dots and all these other concepts that are coming in there. So our program, okay, has these in there, okay, but unfortunately, for all these nanotechnologies we're talking about, we also have nano funding at the same time. So, and of course, we also think photovoltaics is a huge partner with hydrogen. I think that after the president's announcement, everyone came in to be the best partner for hydrogen. I think at first it was natural gas, but then we had a shortage. And so a lot of the renewables were able to carve out something, wind, biomass, everything. But certainly hydrogen, the solar hydrogen partnership, and I'm going to say a little bit about this, and this is my cartoon. I like this from the Washington Post. You won't tell anyone, okay, Tex? Anyway, that's, you know, he pulls up to that thing there and says, hey, Mr. President, fill up my hydrogen car with the fuel, okay? And then the president says, well, we don't have the technology yet, nor the distribution, nor the hydrogen, all right? And that's kind of how we stand. And by the time they realize this, I'll be long out of office, and it takes off. So the problem is there's a lot of work to be done. You know, if this technology is going to make it, you know, it's been handed off, okay, and see what happens. And the problem is a lot of the funding isn't making it into the R&D community, and that is another thing to look at. And I'm going to look at hydrogen a little differently, okay, because I hope Nate, I'm not sure what Nate's going to talk about, but I've heard Nate talk so well about what can happen with fuels in the future, and I hope he takes it from there. I'm going to look at hydrogen a little bit from the distributed point of view on this thing. And I was told by the economists yesterday that for the scientists, I should talk about the production technologies, especially, to say something about them. You know, there really are two ways for photovoltaics and this whole thing to make the hydrogen. One is directly using photolysis. A lot of people in this room have worked on this. Art Nozick, okay, has worked on this technology way back to, you know, essentially put a solar cell in water is what you want to do and make the hydrogen and oxygen out of it. The other way is indirect. You make the electricity from the sun, and then you power some sort of an electrolysis machine in order to make the hydrogen. So those are the two things. And yesterday, someone asked me, what is electrolysis? So last night I went on the web, because I wasn't really quite sure, and decided to pull it down. I found it, okay, and I found this on there, and I think that this is PV electrolysis, because I think these are actually solar cells on that very machine. So the website is up there for those people who want to check this out. There has to be some funding in that area coming up anyway. Well, is this stuff new? Is it only a concept? If you look back at these programs that we've had in the United States, very little has not been worked on before. And in fact, if you look back, oh, I'm sorry, this is, I'm going to come back to that later. Cogeneration, this is now being used. Okay, in Australia, a company using these things, great. And going on. So this was a 60 Minutes thing on the hydrogen. I always like this because they actually mentioned, you know, 2 years ago that renewables have a place in making hydrogen. So that was pretty good. And if you look at this, let's look at what this hydrogen future might look like. And it's kind of a representation that I had put together. You know, we can start off with our solar residence, our zero energy home, which is our photovoltaics and our solar thermal on top, whoever asked about that. I think they're going to go together eventually. Also, we may have zero energy communities like this banding together and sharing their power. And beyond that, we may even have some solar car parks in there to add more of this electricity and energy into our thing. But what we may want to do is explore this whole total energy village if we look at this thing. And let's just take a drive-through here and come up on one of these houses and look in here. If you can turn on the lights, thanks. You can see the electrolyzer and the fuel cell might be in there. Okay, it might be distributed at this residential level. And if we back up, you can see that they might be feeding through those pipes. Okay, we come up here through the trees and come down and look down. They might have some bank of storage in there with hydrogen and oxygen. Okay, so they can feed your fuel cell at night, so you have 24-hour power. And during the day, you make hydrogen, and then you combine it at night. Or, you know, even from your car parks up here, this is your family freedom car on the whole thing that is running in the whole thing. And then you have these oh, did you see the water? It evaporated real. It wasn't Houston because it evaporated real. And so we come down here, and underneath there's your hydrogen freedom pumps, okay, and you can have your storage underneath there. But, you know, if we want to look on where this stuff is coming, you're going to have to look at those roofs of those buildings, that existing built environment that we may have up here. And let's take a look at what those collectors might look like. Maybe we don't have to need that storage down below. You come up here, and let's look at this from the side. And it might be a little bit in 30, 40, 50 years, a little bit more complex. Our solar hydro with glass, photovoltaic, solar thermal, some electrolyzer, some storage up there. Okay, do it where you make it. Or maybe, in the future, really the electrochemical solution using photolysis right on the roof of that house. So that kind of looking at this in the future, not something we're going to see next year or in 10 years, but maybe, okay, in the future, if that's really going to come in hydrogen on that thing, kind of the total energy concept. Well, is it only a concept? Well, of course not. As I said, that things are never new. Back in the late 1970s, DOE funded a project at Texas Instruments, okay, to work using spherical silicon solar cells to in a system that had hydrogen bromide. They broke down the hydrogen and bromide into hydrogen and bromine, and it worked. The problem was, of course, the environmental effects of the bromine. Who would want bromine on their roof? But the concept back there did work. So in wrapping this up, saying is that solar hydrogen looks great, but maybe not. All right, there are a lot of drawbacks to hydrogen, okay, but it is the thing that's in vogue now, and I think probably the worry is about being tied up with one option. And we should worry about that a little bit, is not having several pathways to go forward, just in case hydrogen should have some difficulties. So let me end here by looking at this. This is from President Truman, who kind of a lot of people said this, is that as I started off, is that, you know, it's hard to, you know, that you can best treat the future essentially by knowing what's happened in the past. Kind of this whole thing, we've come in 50 years since Bell with an incredible amount of progress, and who knows, you know, what the next 50 years can hold for us. But even more than that is the fact that it's easier to grasp the future if you know what it should look like. And I think that's what I heard a lot of yesterday from this room, is people knew what it should look like and are coming up with the pathways to get us there by 2050. And maybe in 50 years, I'll be passing around one of those panels from that renewable village around here saying, oh, we measured this and it was 1.9% or it was 50% efficient for the solar cells only. So thank you a whole lot, and thanks for your patience and everything with this.
Thank you. We started about 10 minutes late, so we have about 15 minutes for questions if we would like to use them. Any questions? Go ahead.
I guess my question is, you don't seem to be thinking of hydrogen as feedstock for chemical processes replacing natural gas and making gasoline. Couldn't that be intermediate technology before you have solar cars? You could have solar gasoline using hydrogen.
Are you going to address the stuff, Nate? I've heard Nate talk before about what can be done with some of these things. So.
No, I wasn't going to address that directly, but if you were to have hydrogen, of course, being high energy, the party line is, well, hydrogen plus CO2 makes methanol. That's almost thermoneutral. So then once you have methanol, you have hydrocarbon fuels. You didn't have to do that. It's kind of pick 'em. But you know, how do you decide what you're going to do downstream with that energy carrier, whether or not you want to use it directly? So there are a lot of, in principle, options you could think about.
Well, fuel cells and things like that may be 20, 15, 20 years in the future.
Right.
You could put hydrogen in as a replacement for natural gas or chemical feedstock in 2 or 3 years.
And make hydrocarbons out of it.
Yeah.
Yeah, and that's what I was saying. Hydrogen plus CO2 makes methanol. You have liquid hydrocarbon fuel. Right. You could put that in an internal combustion engine.
Maybe we could have a methylizer instead of an electrolyzer.
You could also make hydrocarbons as a Fischer-Tropsch chemistry classic. So nothing prevents us from going to hydrocarbons.
You notice, Ken, I thought I was talking about photovoltaics. I somehow got in this terrible place of chemistry. Very bad for an engineer to go.
One quick question. If you get into recycling hydrogen through some kind of liquid fuel, carbon-based, then you haven't solved the CO2 problem, have you?
Yes, sure.
The CO2 is coming out of the tailpipe.
I don't understand. If it's carbon neutral, if hydrogen makes hydrocarbon fuel from the CO2 of the atmosphere, because it's just closing a loop.
So where are we getting the CO2? Are we getting it from power plants or something like that?
From the atmosphere that's been emitted by the cars that burned it in the first place. So it's a completely, and besides, we're helping that CO2 source. We have a lot more than we had before.
Larry, let me go back to photovoltaics for a second.
Oh, thank God.
Make you feel better. So the trend in the U.S. is in the last couple of year or two a decrease in terms of use or is that use or production?
Well, it turns out that the U.S. The production actually went up in the U.S. When you deal with percentages, but what they had sold into the market was far less than what the competitors had. The growth out of Sharp. Sharp sold more into the United States than the entire U.S.-based industry did last year. So.
And they're going to solve that with a new roadmap?
Well, it's a step toward doing that. What they point out is what they proposed in their first roadmap was highly successful. I mean, it worked. The Japanese and Germans showed it worked. Okay, unfortunately, it wasn't done here. The investments weren't done here. They were done elsewhere. So their first roadmap was one that provided a pathway that they could have done more. And so they hope that this one will catch a little bit more attention. And actually, the part of this one is it provides a little bit more focus on the R&D side of what the industry needs and support. So
I do have a question about photovoltaics. Could you go back to the roadmap?
maybe
Maybe impossible. You can probably
Okay.
tell us. When does the existing roadmap predict that unsubsidized electricity, which is only a small fraction of total energy, electricity costs from PV are competitive with other electric, levelized costs, so about something like a nickel a kilowatt hour?
yeah, they point out in the California markets.
No, that's peak shaving. I asked for
Okay.
baseload power, a nickel a kilowatt hour. When do you get there on this roadmap?
Okay, nickel. Oh, I can actually tell you that if I opened this up and looked at it. It is a nickel is about 2015 to 2017.
2020. And what volume is that per shipped?
I should
Roughly.
give you this. The volume of shipments at that year is roughly about 2.5 gigawatts
2.5 gigawatts.
out of the U.S. manufacturers only.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
That's about 30%,
Right.
35% of the world.
So the reason I'm asking is it may not be aggressive enough. I mean, we're not living in a vacuum here, and we have this potential wall at 2050, and the concern is that, the roadmap may not be. Now, I understand it was constrained by what they believe market forces would do and what R&D forces would do. On the other hand, we have to put this in the context of external drivers to do something about a climate problem, and the concern is that if we did that business as usual scenario, that wouldn't be aggressive enough. The question is how would you accelerate that really significantly, other than the obvious of just put more dollars in that?
Realize that this is not a DOE document. It's not an NREL document.
Okay.
This is put out by the industry itself, and it's their analysis and what they are saying. And you're right. And for some of the industry, this is real aggressive.
Right.
And for some of the industries, if you get the Canarcas in there, this isn't aggressive enough. So, if you look at some parts and some other parts, there is but for overall, it's quite incredible. How about the industry people that it is as aggressive as it is right now? I mean, this is pretty, if you compare it to their first one, but they learned a lot from overseas as well. So. But you're right, Nate. If you look at what's needed in the future, this is really a roadmap that takes it through 2020, 2030.
Larry, does the roadmap call out technologies to get us there, or is it just setting out targets for performance?
The roadmap as it is now sets out targets for performance especially, and you can pretty well look at performance and costs and figure out which technologies. They think that the technologies, the marketplace will sort out the technologies that will make it. They don't think that the national labs or the DOE programs, for instance, should make technology decisions, nor should the labs make market decisions. They think that the markets are going to dictate what technologies are going to make it.
But I'm sort of familiar with roadmaps when I
Yes.
think about the semiconductor
Right.
industry, where the
Oh,
industry has actually defined a technology and then called out technology-focused challenges that are required to get to this target, and
Yeah.
it helps the whole community move forward.
There are some technology challenges that are pointed out in the barrier sections, but they don't, they don't go into details about those things. The big part about this is that certainly they see there are an ensemble of technologies that still need to be looked at before any decisions are made, and they also recognize that right now silicon as it stands is not the thing that's going to make a 2030 or 2040 goal for photovoltaics.
I'll take one last question and let me ask it. We've heard about thermal solar yesterday. We were now hearing about photovoltaic today. Would you dare to comment on who is likely to reach parity with existing power production systems at some point in the future?
Yeah, that's kind of
and
something.
secondly, let me ask, are they competitive? And thirdly, is solar power possibly a distributed system as is the case with photovoltaic?
Yeah, it can. Well, let me answer the first one. Now so I can't remember the first question. But I've neglected to say that this roadmap does also address utility scale photovoltaics, and I feel that there's a place in it as we go along for utility scale photovoltaics, just as they see the industry a place for solar thermal on the utility scale. I think that they recognize this. These technologies, if they are competing at all, they're going to compete from the same point, that the market will make the choices. It won't be, I think the scientists will help in developing and making these things work correctly, but it'll be the market that makes the choices. I think that if you talk to people in the PV industry, there's a wide range of what they think, even on concentrating PV or utility scale PV. But certainly these should not be competing technologies. They're technologies that have some similarities and have some differences, and each meets a demand, and both of them should be supported. The second thing was, what was the last? Okay.
Is thermal solar a possibly distributed technology?
I used to say no. I said, this is terrible. How can you have this stuff? But you know what? Then I became the technology manager for solar for a while, acting only. And then I realized that there were benefits there. People are designing systems for industrial rooftops that are solar thermal. And so I think you can see, that is a distributed technology. And also if you consider although they have some economies of scales they talk about, that they get up to some level where they really are economical, I think that really, that if things would go along, we could see these things on top of commercial buildings as well.
Isn't there a group in Australia at the ANU that's been working on?
I showed the PV part of it, okay, on solar systems, which is also doing some other things. Yes. So
certainly for motels and things like that they've got them for combined heat and power.
Yeah. Do you remember that small dish I showed with the hydrogen? It really didn't have the PV on it yet. It had the solar thermal on it, but I had it. It's the only picture I had. They do PV as well, but they do the solar thermal. Also, they do the hydrogen. So.
With that, let me thank our speaker. And we'll move on to our next speaker, Nathan Lewis, who will be speaking about photocatalytic solar energy.
I think some people have heard me talk about the big
picture of energy with respect to the Marty Hoffert kinds of ground rules before, and I'm not going to do that today. Telling you a little bit more specialized about what we do, because my charter is the photochemical conversion of solar into direct chemical fuel. So I'll tell you about what's going on there. But I also want to revisit, I think, 3 big picture slides, because, in fact, I've changed my thinking a little bit in flux even as late as last night when we had a dinner conversation with Rick Smalley and myself about what 2050 should look like. And I think it is important to recognize that, the different, that we use energy currently in different forms. We use it for different purposes, and it has different values to the end user. And in an energy system, you have to match end use and the value of that with what you're supplying. Doesn't do you any good to supply low-value energy when a user wants high-value electricity, and vice versa. So it's useful to think about that. And the storage component. We should also actually really probably have asked the question of even the photovoltaic numbers of those assumed a free grid and no storage, and if you ever penetrated enough into primary power that you had to deal with that, those costs really ought to be included in the system. So we need to think about that too if we're thinking about greenhouse gas contribution mitigation. So this is useful from just to give you a feeling for what the U.S. economy does. It's a complicated flow diagram. It came from Ken Caldera and the group at Livermore, and I don't want to go through it all. I want to just point out 3 things. If you look at this charge in there, you see that out of total energy use at end use, that roughly a quarter of it is lost in conversion of one form to another. And then there's roughly equal parts used in residential, that is home and light industry uses, and then in heavy industry, and then in transportation. So those are the 3 end users you're giving it to. And furthermore, out of this total of, I can't read the numbers on that screen, but I can read them here. These are exajoules, but that's 19, 23, 27, and so the numbers add up to 50. And electricity into there is about 10 out of 50. So electricity is high-value energy. It's 10 out of 50 joules in whatever units, these are exajoules per year, that is consumed by the end user. So this gives you a mix of what is pretty likely to be the case here, unless we come up also with end uses for transportation, for instance, that don't use chemical fuels. That demand sector's got to be met by fuels, whether it's hydrogen or liquid hydrocarbons, unless we invent a new way of moving cars around with, beamed RF power or something, which is also possible. But unless we do that and cost that into the equation, then you're constrained. Probably the rough guidelines are a third electricity and high-value energy that we pay a premium to make, a third chemical fuels for transportation, and then a third is a toss-up for home light uses. Could be we would heat with electricity. Could be we would heat with low-value fuel like natural gas. But you have to remember also you have to pay a premium if you're going to do that with electricity, and a nickel a kilowatt hour is not cheap home heating fuel by any long shot. So I'll tell you about that. The other point to remember, which hadn't really gotten on me, really hit hard even until last night, is so here are the Hoffert curves that create the gap. So this is a business as usual scenario. This how much would be the amount needed relative to business as usual from renewables, from carbon-free power, including nuclear, to bring you down onto a 750 ppm stabilization curve. And here's a 650, and here's a 550. And we've been focusing on the gap correctly as where the technology needs to take us, or we're way above that in stabilization. But I want to point out also that even to stabilize at 550, which is probably what most people think most aggressive targets could physically ever let us do, if we wanted to stabilize at 350, we can't have any carbon power at all in the system on the planet forever from 2050 onwards. That doesn't seem realistic. I don't think anybody probably in this room would agree that by 2050 we would never burn an ounce of coal, oil, or gas ever again.
Right? So that seems unlikely. So it seems like we'll never really have a shot at stabilizing at 350. But you want to stabilize at 550. Why is 550 picked? 550 is picked as a stabilization not because the climate models show that's safe, not because they show it's unsafe, but because the consensus kind of air in the thumb is people think that under the most aggressive scenarios, this is maybe the most you could do, is to stabilize at 550. There's no scientific reason to set this as a stabilization target versus any other number as a stabilization target, except under the most aggressive case, this is what the minimum we think we could do with the most aggressive targets toward mitigating the experiment. Right? That's the basis for that. It's also true that the climate models show a wide variation, but show that the temperature changes are on the order of 1 to 4 degrees, depending on the models. Those models all may be systematically in error. They all the same ocean model. That ocean model is probably wrong. It doesn't conserve heat in it. And so we don't actually know what the target's going to be, and so we have to kind of go with this. But even this, the point is 550, actually has in it, although the gap that we're focusing on is 10 to 20 terawatts to meet total demand, 10 terawatts of carbon-based power. So it's not as if we have to cut down on fossil energy consumption in any of these scenarios, even if you were to stabilize at 550, for at least, this goes out to 2100. And the 550 scenario actually still has almost 10 terawatts of carbon-based power in it for the whole next century. So the other important point here is I think we need to think about what would we do with that carbon-based power. If it's going to be in the mix, as I assert it's going to be, then we have to figure out where is this most valuable. And I think it's completely clear where it's most valuable. The last thing you will displace is liquid hydrocarbon fuels. And you're going to convert, I think, all the coal, if you have it, to oil if you run out of oil. It may pay price shocks in the meantime, but we have other ways of making higher value energy, electricity. We have maybe even other ways of heating our houses, maybe with hydrogen or natural gas will make pumping it down. But we don't really have any other good technological ways of getting high energy density for mobile transportation. And if we're going to burn fossil energy, it makes sense the marketplace will sort this out and will figure out that we will burn it where its end products are the most valuable, both technically and economically. And the last thing to go, we'll convert our coal into oil if we have to. Okay? So if you subscribe to that, then you subscribe to the notion that what we don't have to do is find a technology that will help with transportation. Because we already have that. And we'll have that available to us for the next century. And if you subscribe to that, and of course if you subscribe to the idea that if you want to get rid of local air pollution, you can do that right now with clean diesel. Low sulfur diesel is to diesel engines and pollution what low lead gasoline was because it enables catalytic converters. It's already proven that 90% of the environmental local benefits, non-CO2 based for cars, are realizable with diesel engines that you could ever get with hydrogen. The key point here is that if you subscribe to that we're going to actually have this in the budget and we're not in a zero carbon environment, then you can subscribe to the idea that there is no reason to shift the transportation initiative away from liquid hydrocarbon fuels. So we don't have to make liquid hydrocarbon fuels for that purpose. Right? That means what do we have to make? What's the other 2/3 of this going to be used for? Well, that guide already told you 1/3 of it's transportation, approximately. It means approximately 1/3 of it could be electricity, and 1/3 of it needs to go to light energy to heat our houses and make our products for heating purposes. So that's what we should be focusing on, I think, if you subscribe to this notion. So you have two different energy values. You have the low energy value that isn't a nickel a kilowatt hour, and you have the nickel a kilowatt hour electricity high value energy. And this mix has to meet both of those two gaps somehow. And I keep coming back to that because I think it's important about what a nickel a kilowatt hour means. If you do a unit conversion from a nickel a kilowatt hour, that's $14 a gigajoule. But you should understand that the cost of coal on energy basis is about $1.50 a gigajoule right now, and there's certainly abundant cheap coal in China at less than this. And oil is only $2 a gigajoule, and biomass is here. And so a nickel a kilowatt hour is high value energy, and you should only use that and could only afford to use that to replace where we currently make from non-renewable sources electricity, not where we heat our houses from, because we use natural gas for that at a much cheaper cost per joule. And if you were to say I'm going to replace the primary power segment of low-value energy with a nickel a kilowatt hour, you're telling people they have to pay $1,000 a month home heating bills, right, is the way that they're going to heat their houses. So that doesn't make sense, right? And that's not a solution. Furthermore, if you did a nickel a kilowatt hour and didn't cost in storage into the equation, that's not fair, because after 20% penetration, the grid isn't free, and there is no storage in the grid. And so if primary power is going to come from an intermittent source, the only fair pricing is to include all the auxiliary parts of the energy system that's needed to do that. So we really need to figure that in as well. Okay. So because of the fact that you, I think, have a hard time envisioning a system from an intermittent source without storage somewhere, there's got to be a component of that that has chemical fuels made. Now, whether or not that chemical fuel is made as hydrogen and made into methanol, which you could do, for instance, because thermodynamically, plants do this, basically. Plants make hydrocarbons. That's what photosynthesis is. It fixes the CO2 in the air and it makes hydrocarbons. Chemically, if you make hydrogen, you may not want to pump it around. You may want to convert that on site with catalysts or even in situ to methanol, because that's carbon neutral, because it takes the CO2 from the air, makes methanol that you pump around as the carrier and back again. So there's an actually interesting debate as to whether, if you had hydrogen made on site by electrolysis, you actually would ever pump it anywhere, as opposed to converting it into a liquid fuel and then using that. You're more compelled to do this for transportation, but I've already given you the thesis now that you don't have to do this for transportation, because the last thing we're going to put into the energy system is a liquid hydrocarbon fuel, if that's what we're going to burn our fossil energy for. Right? So then the mix could favor hydrogen, because you would think of it just like natural gas and pipelines going to homes for home heating and for light heating uses. And of course, I know that I'm saying here that the hydrogen vehicle program should be the last thing on our agenda, but that's what I'm saying. So if you do this on an energy conversion system, you need to think about how to convert it. Electricity should be one of those components. That's the high-value energy component. But if you're going to make chemical fuel for home heating, then it has to be even cheaper, because you have to compete with low-value energy. And so we have to think about ways that we could do that directly, because if you go from a photovoltaic electrolysis system, and if this were a nickel a kilowatt hour, even if the electrolysis system were free, then you've costed yourself out of the market of low-value energy for heat. Right? So that's the goal. And you got to close the loop and include storage in the whole thing. So one way to do that is to make chemical fuels directly. And there are three ways you can think about doing that, of taking a black box with the sun. Plants do it. They do photosynthesis. Photosynthesis itself isn't efficient in doing this. In fact, the fundamental microscopic photosynthetic reaction center is a few % efficient. We know it can't be that efficient because Kazmersky, Larry just showed you the efficiency versus band gap curve, and plants are green. They should be black if they were optimal energy conversion machines. They should have a band gap of 1.4 electron volts, and they don't. They had to look nice and make carbon and hydrogen into their products. And they waste a lot of energy in separating the charge. In fact, if you look at the photosynthetic reaction center, the amount of energy that hits a leaf versus the amount actually stored is only about 0.5%. So that's how efficient they are, and that's why they need large areas. There's no ground rule that says we couldn't genetically modify plants and make them black and grow lots of Franken plants and harness the fuel and co-opt a natural system to make our chemical fuel and solve the storage problem. Right? But if we don't do that, the other way, these are the only two ways they're in production, right? This is in production on a terawatt scale. Photosynthesis runs the planet at 90 terawatts, right? 90 terawatts is a big number. And we're talking, gigawatts here maybe in 2020 for electricity. But they're actually simpler structures. And there's a third way that we work on in my group, is our little piece of this puzzle, is where you, and I'll show you more about that, take basically, instead of co-opting this, since we're not smart enough to know how to do that, how to co-opt biology into making a more efficient machine, we try to co-opt the efficient machines and degrade their efficiency, hopefully not too much, and electrolyze water to make our chemical fuels directly. Now, why would you do this instead of just having a photovoltaic cell on the roof and an electrolyzer in the basement? Well, I already told you, if you have to live with a nickel a kilowatt hour PV on the roof, and you're going to make a low-value chemical fuel, can't afford to do it. The other point is that then you have a balance of systems problem, in that you've made the wrong way on the value chain. You've gone and made high-value energy and then paid a premium to convert it to low-value energy. That doesn't seem like much the right way to do it. And you don't need any wires at all if you have the catalyst that directly absorbs sunlight and makes hydrogen and oxygen. The other important point to think about here is solar photons are only worth 1 electron volt, 1 or 2 eV. And if you're going to transmit electricity, you have to avoid IR losses, step it up to high voltage to, say, 10 kilovolts. But chemical bonds are only worth 1 eV. And so you're going from 1 EV to 10 kilovolts back to 1 EV. Also there's a premium to pay to do that. And that's what nature has figured out, that it takes 1 EV and makes 1 EV bonds out of it. The last thing to remember is when you go to the gas station and fill your tank, you do that through a $5 plastic pipe, and you fill it at a rate of 10 megawatts. And it's pretty obvious that 10 megawatt copper lines can't cost $5 to make that same mass flow equivalent. So, pumping electricity around at large scales is currently not nearly as cheap as pumping around stored chemical fuels. So there are advantages to doing that if you can make them in situ. Nature does this and has figured out that it has to have this photosynthetic reaction center across a membrane, and it needs a membrane because it's also figured out that if it doesn't do that, the hydrogen, in this case, the oxygen on one side and the hydrogen-reducing equivalents that make chemical fuel on the other side, the sugars that it makes, would back-react with each other in the intermediate steps. And this is basically, if you were having an electrical device, this is just back recombination between the electrons that have gone this way and the holes that have gone that way. So it physically puts them across a membrane, and it brings the hydrogen off, and, well, the equivalent. Bugs can make hydrogen. Hydrogenases do that. So the bugs make hydrogen at this side and oxygen at this side, and they spatially separate them to avoid the back reaction. And so that part is good. The only part that's not so good is that they waste a lot of their fundamental energy in doing this charge separation. In fact, the band gap of here is about 1.7 or 1.8 EV, but because the mobility of charge carriers through organics is low compared to the mobility of charge carriers in inorganic periodic crystals, then the amount that's actually harvested, the open circuit voltage, is a lot smaller fraction of the band gap than is the case for inorganic photovoltaics. And that's in part why they don't work so well. Let me skip that. And you can co-opt these systems into working. You can put platinum on one side. Eli Greenbaum at Oak Ridge has done this, and take the reaction center and manganese and photosynthesis on the other side. And this evolves oxygen, just like plants normally do. And this co-opts the system to not make NAD and NADH, but it makes hydrogen on that side. And this actually works for a little while. The platinum later on actually just hydrogenates all the organic matter in the plant, and this dies. But it would be good if we figured out another way to do this that didn't use platinum. We don't have a way to do that yet. So we work on artificial ways to do this that can actually make chemical fuels, and I'll show you a little bit about that. The other thing is that, you see things like this, where this is a photovoltaic concentrator, and we'll focus on the PV part, but you shouldn't forget that from that tiny little area cell, this big thing in the back. That big thing in the back is that incredibly expensive noble metal-containing electrolysis unit, right, that makes the fuel in this system. And I assert that if you got this down to 0, that you couldn't afford to make the hydrogen because you don't have enough noble metal in the world to make enough hydrogen to satisfy demand if we were to do it this way. So we need to equally, if we think about a storage system, work the problem of how in the world are we going to make all that fuel in the first place, and what catalysts are we going to do, because even electrolyzers now are only 50% energy efficient. Furthermore, they scale poorly with current because the IR losses are worse at higher current densities. And so you've taken all this area and all this relatively low current density, you put it into a concentrator to get high current density, and then you have to diffuse it again over a large area electrode because you can't afford the IR drops if you kept it in a small area. And so this uses a tremendous amount of noble metal catalysts. Right? And in fact, estimates are that just the electrolysis part right now is the equivalent of kind of $5 hydrogen gate kind of number. And that's in small scale, and it scales inversely with scale because of these IR drops. So if the cell's free, we have a big fuel forming problem. So one vision is integrate the whole system and put the absorber, whether or not it's come from a plant or come from an inorganic material, right in the liquid and have hydrogen come off one side of the membrane and oxygen come off the other side of the membrane and no wires. This changes the balance of systems cost tremendously because you don't have to have contacts or grids or inverters. You don't have to have a PV module connected in series to an electrolysis module. You do it all in one shot in a membrane that's basically the opposite of a fuel cell. This works. I'll show you how it works. The principles of this there's literally nothing new under the sun, right? I mean, the principles of this were known in 1970s. We haven't come much further than that since then, and I'll tell you why, but it does work. The idea is that when you put a semiconductor in a liquid, it's equivalent to making a photovoltaic metallurgical junction between, say, an N-type base or a P-type base and the opposite carrier type. You have a base charge layer. That's induced by the liquid in the same way it would be induced by doping the other side of the solid. So you don't have to make a metallurgical contact or a doping. This just happens automatically. There's charge transfer between those two interfaces. That makes a space charge layer, and light can be absorbed and make electricity. But these can be merged without a wire, and it can make chemical fuel. If the holes come out, they will oxidize water and make oxygen, and the electrons at the other side will reduce water and make hydrogen. We know this works. There are a series of materials that are stable in water and sustain the electrolysis of water with 1 to 2% efficiency, total solar. And the reason they're 1 to 2% efficiency is because their band gap's wrong. So they work great on the moon because they only respond in the ultraviolet. Their band gap's about 3.2 eV. And single band gap materials that work are all falling into the metal oxide classes. There's a good reason for that is that historically, in the 70s, these were the minerals that people used. TiO2 actually doesn't work unassisted for the aficionados. You need about 1/10 of a volt in. This is worth 1.23 volts of electrolysis. So it's photo-assisted, but these other materials, especially strontium titanate and potassium tantalate, are unassisted. You can paint these metal oxides onto a substrate. I mean, the TiO2 is paint. So you can take the pigment of white paint and paint it onto a substrate and just dunk it in water and shine light on it, and it magically splits water into chemical fuel and stores that for you, and then you can burn it later on if you want. So that works with unassisted electrolysis. But the problem is that metal oxides are the only system that are known now that are stable to anodic corrosion in water for long periods of time because they're already oxidized. And so all the favorite photovoltaic absorber materials like gallium arsenide, silicon, cadmium sulfide, they themselves in an oxidizing environment oxidize and corrode. And so there's no law of nature that says, in principle, that we can't find a metal oxide or a material with the right band gap that couldn't spontaneously electrolyze water by itself. We just don't know of one right now. You want the band gap to be down here, the band gap is up there. There were relatively exhaustive efforts in the 1970s to search through in low throughput fashion, the known metal oxides, and none of those that had the right band gap met the criteria needed to split water and sustain that. But that doesn't mean that there isn't any. In fact, in our approach right now, that I won't tell you in some detail, we are doing what people who don't have fundamental understanding of that do. We're screening everything we can screen. We're just combinatorially now using the methods of combinatorial chemistry, making every metal oxide we can and trying to see which ones are stable in water, but also being a little smarter in that actually what you saw in nature was that nature actually didn't use one absorber. Nature, for the people that know photosynthesis, is a heterojunction. It uses 2 photons to create its voltage, because one is absorbed in the red in the photosystem 2 and the second is in photosystem 1. And so it basically steps up the voltage to get half the current in a current match scheme. And the idea here is that it was too much to ask to have a metal oxide that spontaneously split water with the right energetics. And that you don't need to do that because, in fact, chemists will tell you that the metal oxides will be stable to oxidizing environments and metal sulfides will be stable to reducing environments. And this is our approach, where we're looking for metal sulfides that are known. In fact, biology uses metal sulfides, iron sulfides, as hydrogenases to reduce water to hydrogen catalytically. So it does that already. And we're trying to make the photocathode, basically, the metal sulfide, and the photoanode, the metal oxide, and then bridge them through a membrane. And the idea here is that this is exactly the opposite of a fuel cell. Fuel cells would take this chemical fuel and would create electricity. And so this is the membrane electrode assembly in a fuel cell. And this would be the membrane electrode assembly in an electrolysis cell, where instead of energy out of electricity, the energy goes input from sun, and it creates the chemical fuels. The nice thing about this is any system that made these fuels would likely have a fuel cell on the backside to use them. And so the same catalysts that are developed here to lower the overpotentials for hydrogen and oxygen use are going to be the ones that we're going to put in here to make it in the first place. So there's a program at Caltech to do this, and we're just starting that. As someone said, Texas Instruments system already does work. It works by a more engineering approach where it's a photovoltaic cell. It's a silicon cell. Silicon cells can only deliver in tandem. This actually was a dual wired up little PN, NP back-to-back junction. So it has a volt open circuit and at maximum power about 700 millivolts. And 700 millivolts is enough at maximum power to chemically drive HBr but not H2O to be split. Because they had that constraint of only driving 700 millivolts and not 1.23 volts out of their tandem little wired up spheres, they were only able to do HBr. Now that's actually still not terrible if you were interested in this as an integrated storage system because it stores that energy and then you can not pump the hydrogen around, because if you pump the hydrogen around you have all this bromine building up. And that's why oxygen is much better, because you can get it from the air wherever you need it. But this is an integrated photoelectrolysis and storage system at the same time. It solves the balance of systems issue, but needs to be evaluated analytically as to what that buys you in terms of an integrated storage, electrical, versus taking a PV cell and actually going off to a remote storage system to do that. So the notion is you have load leveling here, and you don't have any grid obscuration. If you have small bandgap semiconductors, there is some work to stabilize them in aqueous solutions. Like molybdenum diselenide actually splits hydrogen iodide in a SIML system, and that works well. It's 10% efficient, and that's for integrated electrical energy directly to chemical fuel. I should comment that none of the circuits actually are built this way. This is how you measure their performance. But in fact, there's just metallization on the backside of a material, just a thin layer of metal, and there's no grids or anything. Light comes in through the front, hits the crystal, and just electrolyzes the material and fuel comes off. In the HI system, you build up H2 and I2, similar to the HBr, and so it integrates the storage here. The downside for this is that this only works on single crystal molybdenum diselenides because step edges are very active recombination sites, and we don't yet know how to passivate them to recombination. So you need pure single crystals over large areas of a relatively rare material. It's not easy to do. The other point is that if you're going to make fuel, targets have to be much more aggressive than a nickel a kilowatt hour, because you can't hide the storage costs in fuel. Right? You have to put them in explicitly because we have a already fuel economy. And so we know what we have to do if you wanted to compete with fuel for home heating, for instance. You have to be less than a nickel a kilowatt hour to system production. Or people realize quickly they're paying $1,000 a month home heating bills. If you put it a nickel a kilowatt hour electricity and don't count the storage, then they won't maybe realize it so fast. So that in our opinion, we should work on a different angle than what the photovoltaics. We should work on the horizon beyond the next horizon where we can see. And one of the trades is that in conventional designs that have really come back from the Bell Labs 1950s, planar junctions, and of course two things happen. One is that means that you have to have a certain thickness of material to absorb the light, but that also constrains the lifetime you have to have and the purity, because you have to have a material pure enough to get the carriers separated over the distance that they have to be collected. And so one of the goals, as everybody in PV working knows about, is always the struggle of paying the cost to get material pure enough to get its efficiency up, as well as manufacturing that in high yield. So we have some ideas on how to get off that cost curve that can be kind of uniquely exploited in liquids. And one idea is that you want really to orthogonalize spatially the dimension that you collect carriers relative to the dimension that you absorb them. If I could collect them sideways, but absorb them thickly, then maybe I could use really short diffusion length material and do that. Now, Manufacturing these has always been a bane. In fact, Martin Green proposed this a long time ago for silicon cells, stacking them on their side, showed that it worked, but was never able to manufacture them at all. But nanotechnology can change that because, in fact, here's a design that on paper looks like it will fit that criterion. Suppose this is silicon and it's 100 microns thick. I don't have to make 100 micron diffusion length silicon if these are nanometer diameter rods that I have current sleeves to collect them on, because now I can collect them laterally, and the diffusion length can only be a nanometer or 10 nanometers, even though I can have the full absorption length normal to the surface. We've actually done, with Harry Atwater and my group, a full analytical device physics model of how these will perform as a function of lifetime surface recombination velocity and doping. And so we are pretty confident we know what we have to make. And we also know that analytically, if we do that, we can use much more impure material than you could use in a conventional planar solar cell and get the same voltage. Now, we don't know the manufacturing cost of this, but we're trying to make them to see if, in fact, we can show that this will work. The reason that we're trying to make them isn't necessarily because we think that these will be the best in photovoltaic junction devices, per se, in solid state. But if you can make these pillars in a template and the liquid can fill it up, then you solve the contact problem. And you can use this as the membrane that I told you about that you would need to do the photoelectrolysis in that system before. And we make these membranes. You can etch just electrochemically alumina. It's well known as a template, depending on the current control. You control the current, you can do this over very large areas, square meters, and you can etch them to be periodic and have nanopores that are controlled in dimensions. And then we take those pores and we fill them with paint, we fill them with titania. If you fill them at a controlled conditions on a sol gel process, you only coat the sidewalls of those pores. And then you can either release those and make soda straws that are basically current collector, or you can fill them up with something else as the photoactive rod. So these are actually, their thickness is defined by the thickness of the aluminum that went into making the alumina. So they can be millimeters thick or hundreds of microns thick. And so we make hundreds of microns long rods that are a few nanometers in diameter. And the nice thing about this is if you were to fill these with a plug of a material that's the photoactive part, then that can be relatively low diffusion length material because you've got a current collecting sleeve on every one of these. Now, we don't have an idea on how to manufacture these in bulk yet. One idea is we're going to make them and purify them all and then just spray them down, orient them. But we can make the straws. So this is an aluminum membrane. Here are the etching of the pores. Here's the straws that we get when we coat the sidewalls with TiO2. We release the alumina from that, and then you can pack them, and you can see this is an all-inorganic, robust membrane of a metal oxide of TiO2 that by itself, if we shine light on it, as I told you, with catalysts on either side, would almost, unassisted by itself, split water and act as the separation membrane. But the more important point is when you fill them with the either liquid or the inorganic absorber, the idea is that you can do this at a much less material purity than you could have done with single crystal silicon because you spatially separate these two dimensions. And we're trying to do that right now. The catalysts are equally important because if we don't avoid noble metal catalysts, we'll never get the cost point down to fuel. As I said, we know nature does that. We only now know that nature hydrogenases use either nickel or iron. All fuel cell catalysts, by the way, that are hydrogen fuel cells, the low temperature ones, are poisoned by sulfur. And you'll always hear people say how pure the hydrogen stream is needed in order to keep a fuel cell working at low temperature. But nature figured that out. In fact, they're also poisoned by carbon monoxide. And the natural molecule is a diiron compound that actually incorporates in it both carbon monoxide and sulfur. So it's not poisoned at all. In fact, it uses those as key ingredients. And this is as active as platinum at lower overpotential than platinum and occurs at room temperature at the thermodynamic potential, as biology always runs its system, where it takes protons and electrons and makes hydrogen, and takes hydrogen and runs backwards and makes protons and electrons. This structure has only been recently solved by X-ray crystallography on an iron-only hydrogenase, and Jonas Peters at Caltech, along with my group and Harry Gray, is building small molecule models of this. We actually have small molecules of model of this that do evolve hydrogen, but they just don't do it yet at the same overpotential that biology does. And part of our goal is to develop these catalysts that are both CO and sulfur tolerant and run at room temperature, because we know we need that if we're going to integrate these into the solar system, because we can't have these cells operating at 80 degrees all the time and have platinum everywhere in them. So we don't know the answer to that yet, but as I said, the storage part is as important as any of the other part of the system, and we have to think about that, so we're trying to build that in. There's another strategy here that we're pointed to in liquids. We only use liquids as ways of probing interfacial recombination, and I won't talk about that much. Early work that we did showed that there were organometallic agents that are useful in liquids to stabilize silicon against corrosion. They've got great spectral responses. They have 15% efficient solar cells. You could make them 20% if you engineered the grid losses. Maybe there's a reason you might want to take a solid liquid junction to work. We don't really know of one that there is. So they work. But the important point is that in doing that, there are probably only, I think, 2 ways to get off the cost per watt curve, at least in principle. And one is to use, as I've said, small grain boundary material. The physics of this is that if you were to take silicon and use 1 micron grain size, all the grain boundaries are recombination sites. And the reason for that physically is all those surface silicon atoms know that they're not bonded to 4 other silicon atoms in the bulk. And so every time an electron hole pair gets to one of the ends of the stepping stone, it doesn't hop across it. And in fact, it just recombines. The only ways we know how to surface passivate silicon from the photovoltaic industry are oxide and nitride. And the problem with them in this arrangement is that those are really great insulators. And so you passivate the particles, but you totally block electrical current flow from going from one to the next. So we're interested in what we've lovingly called solar paint. It's no better than any thin film in concept, but it's interesting to think about the way we do this. We do this as we look at the surfaces of silicon, the 101, the 101 surface, and do chemistry on them. In the 101 surface, you can start with a wet chemical etch. It's hydrogen terminated. That makes oxide. That oxide's insulating. That's bad for us because the native oxide actually has a high interfacial recombination velocity. We develop chemistry. That chemistry involves first chlorinating the surface in a wet chemical dunk in a solution that's basically oxy-5. It's benzoyl peroxide. And then we alkylate that surface. We actually alkylate it with another wet chemical dip in an anaerobic solution. But when you do that right, especially with methyl groups, you terminate every silicon surface atom. And for the aficionados here, the surface recombination velocity in air is less than 10 centimeters per second after months. And what that means is that less than 1 atom in every 100,000 is electrically defective for months on that surface. And this was a room temperature wet chemical process. What we're doing with this is because these are not insulating, but because we can use the conducting organic principles of conducting organic polymers, is we actually are exploring now whether or not we can actually terminate the surface and, unlike oxide, have a resonant bridge between one particle and the other, where the idea is that what we'll do is we're going to make the electrons hop from particle to particle and not the holes. And then in a separate process, make the holes hop from particle to particle, not the electrons. And you can see what would happen if you could do that. You would basically have made binder and pigment, and you've made paint. Where one side is the N-type paint and the other side is the P-type paint. And you've done that out of low diffusion length small particles where you passivated each particle and gone from hop to hop. The idea here is that the ability to process from the bottom up materials on the nanoscale can actually change the way you can think about the dimensionality of the problem. Now let me go ahead. Finally, the last way to think about this is that if you want to so Michael will talk more about these efficiently known as Grätzel cells in his honor, about dye-sensitized solar cells. Where I think they're really interesting is maybe not even whether or not the first generation that's been explored works, but in the conceptual idea that the other approach to thinking about whether or not you can use relatively inexpensive absorbers on this integrated system approach to yield relatively high efficiencies is that there's, again, no reason why you can't spatially separate the dimensions of collection from the dimensions of absorption. You might absorb in this way and collect that way. And this is kind of the ultimate interpenetrating network. And you can think about an interpenetrating network as 2 combs that are interpenetrating where they're opposite carrier types, and carriers can move between one set of comb fingers and hop onto the other set and go the other way. In this implementation, the combs here are a liquid and the other combs here are the conducting particles that are the solid. But the whole idea of interpenetrating networks as a way to minimize the collection length this way while maintaining absorption that way is an interesting physics kind of based approach to using low purity materials to get high efficiencies. And the fact that this works at 10% even in test champion cells in the lab, is evidence that you can make these interpenetrating networks really work on very impure materials to start from in relatively simple manufacturing processes. Basically, our nanorods were just a structured version of these interpenetrating networks that we're trying to optimize the transport and absorption because we optimize the dimensionality of the problem in the rods to be absorbed that way and then transport and collect optimally that way. Whether or not you manufacture them that way or manufacture a random interpenetrating network above the percolation threshold on this phase and this phase is not really yet known, but the idea of separating spatially the absorption and collection, I think, is a good idea. So Michael does this with a dye that absorbs light. It sensitizes that pigment in paint, and the dye then runs around and makes electricity. I think the ultimate virtue of this is going to be if we can not make electricity, but if we can make chemical fuels. Because, again, they could fit into the membranes that would change that, and then you can argue that that would be very useful to do because it would add value relative to the competition. If you just had to make electricity, you're competing with standard PV technology. So finally, I think the goals of this are, we have clues from nature that this works. There's a whole other field, by the way, of small molecules that are put in water, that absorb sunlight, that spontaneously split water. I don't personally see any of those systems working in the long run. And the reason I don't see them working is they don't address the spatial separation problem. Because if you don't physically separate where you make the oxygen from where you make the reduced chemical fuels, then you've got thermodynamics against you, and that's going to go kaboom the instant the light turns off. So you have to spatially separate somehow. There has to be a membrane that has to look either like that plant or like a membrane electrode assembly in a fuel cell. Seems like the best way to do it is to leverage the R&D that we'll be doing on fuel cells to use those fuels into the same R&D we're going to use to make them, and use the same catalysts, and just change the function of the membrane to be one that purely transmits charge to being one that absorbs light and moves that charge around. So that's what we're trying to do. We don't know how to do that yet. We're trying to stabilize these small band gap semiconductors in water because we know we need something with the right band gap, or we're still only going to work on Mars. We need a more complete understanding of the surface modification of what does it take to really passivate small particles and glue them together to transport electrons and not holes and vice versa. And what does it take to develop effective catalysts for these fuel-forming reactions. So all of these nano plays a key role because this is all enabled by that scale, length, and dimension. And I think it's the only thing that's interesting about these from the point of view of why would we do them compared to electricity as a module and then fuel as a module separately, and separately optimize them is this issue of integration and of not having to step up the voltage and avoid that balance of systems cost. How that'll actually come out in analysis is worth a serious look and a trade, and someone really needs to do that to see how much basically you replace pumping and inverting and pumping electrons around with pumping fuel around or using it as the in-situ storage. And there must be some scenarios where that's advantageous to do, but I'd like to actually see a full analysis of how that costs out as an energy system to see just where it would fit in the best. So that's what we're doing in this area, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Questions?
Hey, Ken Scotson. Ken Scotson.
I've always been nervous about the stability associated with these systems, and you touched on that a little bit. It really is a barrier to thinking about them because of the concern that they're really short term. So could you help us with that?
Sure. So there are two things to say. I agree completely. In fact, everybody working in the area knows that stability is the biggest long-term implementation barrier, even if you solve the short-term ones. The metal oxides are really stable in water to oxidation. They've been shown to be stable for months operating at 100 suns of concentration. So with laser beams shining right at them, basically metal oxides can't oxidize anymore Okay? So they're stable. And the metal sulfides and the small game things are completely unstable. Right? So no one's found a way to stabilize them in water to oxidation by themselves. And so the problem is, if you look back at it now, of what happened 20 years ago, was people wanted the one magic material to both oxidize and reduce water. And so by lowering the band gap, they were driven to put the unstable materials into water, and they were fighting thermodynamics. And that was a bad thing to do. Right? So in this scheme, we take the metal sulfides where they're stable in reducing environments and never let them see the oxidizing environment. They're on the opposite side of the membrane. We take the metal oxides where they're thermodynamically stable and put them in the oxidizing form of the membrane and never let them see the reducing environment and try to get them to work that way. Right? Because I agree, I don't think you'll fight thermodynamics for a 20-year lifetime. Right? Now, we know the metal sulfides are stable to reducing environments because this is how you cathodically protect pipelines. Right? So it's the exact same technology. So I think that there's a possibility you might be able to get this to work. That's about as far as I was going to go in an unqualified statement.
Yes.
Nate, in your Michael Katz from Switzerland. Nate, in your cartoon with the tandem cell, the light seemed to be hitting the sulfide first. Is that just a cartoon?
It was just a
drawing?
cartoon. That was
Okay.
backwards. Well, it depends on the band gaps, but that would be backwards, right? In that scenario, light would hit the metal oxide first, go through, sulfide. Yeah. I should change the arrow. Right.
Any other questions? Yes.
Your picture of the ideal is Sibrahman.
Right.
This is a picture of your ideal solar cell. Seem to have something like nanotubes, stacked between two plates. And
No.
what sort of density do you really need in order to make it really work?
Right, to absorb all the light. Yeah. So obviously, if you're coming in at normal incidence, it's different than coming in at an angle, right? And there are some light management tricks you could play, but it has to be pretty dense. So we're actually making these by top down and bottom up. We're making them by alumina pore filling, but we're also making them by just etching little channels lithographically in crystal and silicon, which sounds backwards. Why would we take crystal and silicon and etch holes in it? Because we just want to understand how well these things will perform. So all the PV people are immediately going to say, what you've done is you've changed a planar junction to a cylindrical junction, and what you've done is you've increased the junction area per unit of collection area, and so you've increased your junction recombination current by 2 pi r, and that's backwards. But you've increased your collection. You need a way to passivate the junction. We have a way to passivate the junction because we can methyl terminate those rods, and we know the surface recombination velocity is very low. It's 10 centimeters per second. So we can afford to have a lot more junction area to play off against the lower diffusion length that we're going to put in there. And we've modeled all that, and that's a trade. These can make 10% efficient cells with really low diffusion length silicon that would fill the rods. We don't know how to do that. You would CVD that probably. But we're just trying to explore the idea of separating spatially the direction you collect from the direction that you absorb, which seems like a reasonable idea.
We got a question over here.
Prashant Kamath from Notre Dame. Nate, you showed that hydrogen harvesting farm using particle systems. And in order to generate hydrogen, you touched these less noble metals or complexes like iron. And there is a couple of new things that are coming up, like these gold layers on titania, nitrogen doping, trying to improve the energetics of the semiconductor cell.
Right.
And I think there is a lot to know and understand. The new things that's coming up can make these catalysts more active. That's what I want to comment.
Sure. So I actually didn't include here because I'm not sure I trust it. But there was a report in Science and a separate report in Nature by two separate groups on different materials, one of which claimed a stable photoanode in water that spontaneously electrolyzed water with 8% solar to fuel efficiency, which would be, you couldn't do that in an integrated system with a 20% efficient PV system right now hooked up to an electrolyzer because of the electrolysis inefficiency. But I didn't mention it because it's not been independently verified, and I'm not sure I trust it.
Over here.
Just to continue the question ask about this nanotube density. You show the diameter around 10 nanometer, which is pretty close, quantum confinement, this kind of stuff. And my question is about the defects in that kind of system to stabilize 10 nanometer diameter nanotubes, metal nanotubes.
Actually,
and they can't keep photovoltaic effect. My question is the defects and how you are going to fight that.
Our optimum diameter rods from design are about 100 nanometers.
Yeah,
basically, you want the rod diameter just commensurate with the collection length that you can have in unpurified silicon that hasn't been zone refined would be the way to think about it. So if you pick your lifetime, you want a 1 microsecond lifetime, you can have, these things are all space charge filled anyway if there's any kind of junction in them. So you're going to sweep it out to the side. So they'd be about 100 nanometers big in diameter, and then absorption depth 10 microns, 50 microns long. Right, would be the idea.
Would this be limited to one sun, or could these nanotubes take multiple suns?
We have no idea. I haven't even made them yet. Let's not go too far.
Can I just comment?
Yes.
There is also a couple of recent papers making TiO2 nanorods, chemical synthesis, and I think that may be much, and you can control the size of this diameter and...
Right. So in fact, Charlie Lieber's group and some other groups have made rod-like PN junctions already. So the nano people have started to broach this area from the synthetic tools. We've kind of come at it from a design principles first and said, what would we want to make in terms of dimensions, and where could there be advantages in efficiency for really low diffusion length material, and where's the sweet spot kind of spatially, and what does the surface recombination velocity have to be to actually make this work well, and how would you get there? So we kind of have an analytical model first, but both are okay. People make TiO2 rods.
Any other questions? Super.
I may just ask you to extend it to the Mars surface, for example, where you have plenty of CO2. How do you change your methodology? Because that's where we want to go in 2050.
Oh, yeah, these probably would work pretty well on Mars. Actually, comment one more thing. So I started to talk about methanol. I'm going to switch the question like a good politician here. Yeah, that happens a lot in the debates. So if you want to think about making methanol or hydrocarbons in a process that doesn't have to pump CO2 from the air, the only way you can do that without having to pump it is to match the natural flux of CO2 in the air, and plants do that. For the photovoltaic people, the natural flux of CO2 to the air to a plane in the ground at 300 ppm is worth 6 milliamps per centimeter squared. Okay? That's what it's worth. That's the current density you can get if you just connect an electrode up and reduce CO2 to methanol and just let it, by mass transport, go to a plane. Okay? So you could take, parasitically, if you had the right catalyst, 6 milliwatts per centimeter squared, 6 milliamps per centimeter squared out of any cell as short circuit current and divert it into naturally taking CO2 and fixing it into a fuel, methanol. If you want to think about, I have a magic system that'll do that, and then I could divert the rest to electricity if I wanted to. Right? But that's all you can get. That's the other point. You can't get any more than 6 milliamps per centimeter squared without having to pump the CO2. And by the time you think about PV pressure pumping, the losses in doing that are so big that no one knows how to pump all that CO2 out of the air. So solar concentrators don't work for that purpose because they take all the sunlight and put it into a point source, and the point source CO2 flux can't support it. So the only thing that can support directly fixing CO2 in an artificial photosynthesis mode are systems that work at 5 to 6 milliamps per centimeter squared, or take that amount of current and do it, and no more. Okay, so.
Gee, sounds like an argument for letting CO2 rise in the atmosphere.
Yeah, right. Exactly. That's why plants grow better with higher CO2.
Do we have any other questions? We're going to take a break. Our next speaker has not made it yet, and so we'll take a break and then probably reconvene with Dr. Michael Gretzel's talk. So we'll make that 10:30, sure. Reconvene.
Sure.
Your comment that the iron compound has efficient as platinum.
Hydrogenases